Jake Murphy stood at the edge of the ice field and checked his equipment one more time. The cold wind of Arcturus Prime cut through his thermal suit like a knife. Around him, 4 alien beings prepared for their descent into the frozen moon's depths. Each one looked completely different from the others, and all of them looked nothing like Jake. Captain Rex Voltan towered over everyone else. His thick green scales caught the pale light from the distant sun. The Soran warrior carried weapons that could punch holes through metal walls. His species came from hot desert worlds where they hunted massive beasts with their bare claws. Rex had volunteered for this mission because he thought it would be easy. Zach 9 moved with quick, jerky motions that hurt Jake's eyes to watch. The Vexari looked like a giant ant that walked on 2 legs. Her black shell shined like mirror glass, and her forearms never stopped moving. She could talk to thousands of her people across space without any radio. The Vexari hive mind made them perfect scouts and messengers. The third team member barely looked real. Keth 7 appeared to be made of living crystal that changed colors as he moved. The Lithan could read temperature, radiation, and chemical traces through his skin. His people lived on worlds where the air would freeze solid if humans tried to breathe it. Nothing could be too cold for him. The last alien team member was the strangest of all. Wisp Flow had no solid body that Jake could see. The ethereal looked like blue smoke shaped into the form of a person. She could walk through walls and survive in the vacuum of space. Her people considered physical matter to be a minor inconvenience. Jake looked at his own reflection in his helmet visor. Brown hair, brown eyes, average height, average build. He came from Earth's Antarctic Research Division, where he spent years learning how to survive in places that wanted to kill him. But compared to his alien teammates, he felt like he brought nothing special to this mission. Dr. Vera Collins spoke to them through their helmet radios from the ship orbiting above. Energy readings are stronger than ever. Whatever is down there has been waiting for millions of years. Stay in contact every 30 minutes. The team began their descent into the massive crack in the ice. Jake had seen glacial formations before, but nothing like this. The walls around them glowed with a soft blue light that seemed to come from deep inside the ice itself. Strange symbols covered the smooth surfaces carved by hands that had turned to dust long before humans learned to make fire. Rex took the lead, his heavy boots crushing ice crystals with each step. "This place feels dead," he said through the radio. "My people can sense life from great distances. There is nothing here but old stone and frozen water." Zach 9 disagreed. "The hive tells me otherwise. Something watches us from the deep places. Something that does not wish to be found." Keth 7's crystal body pulsed with different colors as he read the environment around them. These walls contain technology far beyond what any of our species possess. The ice itself has been changed, made into something that can store and conduct energy. Wisp Flow drifted ahead of the group, her form passing through thick ice barriers to scout the path forward. The passages extend much deeper than our scans indicated. This place was built for a purpose we do not yet understand. Jake said nothing, but he watched everything. His survival training had taught him to notice details that others might miss. The ice formations were too regular to be natural. The blue glow came from networks of lines that ran through the walls like veins. Most importantly, the temperature readings on his suit showed patterns that made no sense for a natural cave system. They walked for hours through tunnels that spiraled down into the moon's core. The alien technology in the walls grew more complex. As they descended, symbols changed into moving patterns that hurt to look at directly. The blue glow became brighter and started to pulse like a heartbeat. "My instruments detect massive energy buildup ahead," Keth 7 reported. "Whatever powered this place is still active." Rex laughed, a sound like grinding stones. "Good. If something down here wants a fight, I will give it one." Jake checked his equipment again. His weapons were simple compared to what the others carried. Chemical explosives, heating elements, and basic projectile weapons. Nothing that could cut through starship armor or freeze enemies solid. But his gear had one advantage. It was designed to work when everything else failed. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber that took their breath away. The ceiling stretched up into darkness beyond their lights. Ice formations hung down like frozen waterfalls, but they pulsed with energy that made them glow like stars. In the center of the chamber stood a structure that looked like a giant crystal flower made of ice and metal. "Incredible," whispered Dr. Collins through the radio. "The energy readings just spiked beyond anything we've ever recorded. You're looking at technology that makes our best systems look like stone tools." Zack-9's antennae twitched wildly. "The hive screams warnings. We should not be here. This place holds death for all who enter uninvited." Before anyone could respond, the blue glow in the wall suddenly dimmed. The pulsing stopped. In the new darkness, Jake heard something that made his blood freeze, the sound of ice cracking under enormous pressure. Wispflow's voice came through the radio, filled with panic. "Something moves in the walls, something large, something that has been sleeping for a very long time." The temperature in the chamber began to drop rapidly. Jake's breath clouded inside his helmet as his suit's heating system struggled to keep up. Around them, the ice formation started to shift and change shape. Rex raised his weapons and roared a challenge. "Whatever you are, come and face me." The ice answered him. Massive shapes began to emerge from the walls, creatures that looked like they were carved from living crystal and frozen lightning. Their eyes glowed with the same blue light that had filled the tunnels. They moved with deadly grace despite their size, flowing through solid ice like it was water. Jake's training kicked in as his mind raced to process what he was seeing. These things were not just animals, they were guardians. This place had been built to keep something locked away, and the team had just triggered its defenses. The hunt was about to begin, and Jake knew that everything his teammates thought they knew about survival was about to be tested by creatures that had been perfecting the art of killing for millions of years. The first creature erupted from the wall behind Rex with explosive force. Ice shards flew everywhere as something the size of a small building burst into the chamber. The glacial hunter looked like a nightmare made of living crystal and frozen death. Its body was transparent blue ice, but Jake could see energy flowing through it like glowing blood. Rex spun around and fired his plasma cannon directly into the creature's chest. The blast that could melt through starship armor barely scratched the hunter's crystalline hide. The creature's response was swift and terrible. It opened what passed for a mouth and released a beam of energy so cold that the air itself turned solid and fell like snow. The Sauron warrior's armor, designed to withstand the heat of desert suns, shattered like glass under the extreme cold. Rex's roar of defiance turned into a scream of pain as ice crystals formed in his blood. Within seconds, the mighty warrior was nothing more than a frozen statue. "Rex," Jake shouted, but there was nothing anyone could do. The hunter had already turned its attention to the next target. Zack-9 tried to use her speed advantage, skittering across the icy floor with movements too fast for human eyes to follow. But the Vexari's greatest strength became her weakness. As she attempted to send a warning to the hive mind, the psychic connection left her vulnerable. The hunter seemed to sense the mental energy and locked onto it like a missile finding its target. The creature didn't even need to move. It simply focused its cold beam on the Vexari scout, and Zack-9's rapid movements slowed, then stopped completely. Her black shell turned white with frost, and her multiple arms froze in mid-motion. The hive mind's constant chatter in her head went silent forever. 2 team members down in less than a minute. Jake's heart pounded as more hunters emerged from the walls. These creatures moved through solid ice like dolphins through water, appearing and disappearing without warning. Their blue eyes tracked every movement with predatory intelligence. Keth-7 tried to use his natural cold resistance to fight back. The Lithan's crystalline body could survive temperatures that would kill any organic life form. He charged directly at the nearest hunter, confident that his natural armor would protect him. The Lithan discovered too late that these creatures were not simply cold. They could drain thermal energy directly from living tissue. As Keth-7 made contact with the hunter, Jake watched in horror as the alien's natural glow began to dim. The creature was literally sucking the life force out of the Lithan through temperature manipulation. Keth-7's confident charge became a desperate struggle for survival. His crystal body began to crack as his internal energy was pulled away. The colors that normally flowed through his form faded to dull gray. When the hunter finished feeding, The lithium crumbled into lifeless fragments that scattered across the ice. Wispflow tried to use her ability to phase through matter to escape, but the ethereal's advantages meant nothing to creatures that existed in multiple dimensions. As she attempted to become incorporeal, the hunters somehow tracked her energy signature across the dimensional barrier. Jake watched as Wispflow's gaseous form was pulled back into physical reality by forces he couldn't understand. The ethereal's panic was clear even though she had no face to show expression. She tried to flee through the chamber walls, but the hunters herded her like predators driving prey into a trap. The final attack came from 3 hunters working together. They surrounded Wispflow and created some kind of energy field that forced her to maintain solid form. Unable to escape, the ethereal was quickly frozen into a sculpture of blue ice that still held the shape of her terror. Jake found himself alone in the chamber with at least 6 glacial hunters circling him like sharks. His 4 teammates lay dead around him, each killed by creatures that seemed specifically designed to counter their natural advantages. The hunter's blue eyes studied him with curious intelligence, as if they were trying to figure out what kind of threat this small, soft creature might pose. Jake's radio crackled with Dr. Collins's voice from orbit. "Jake, respond. What's happening down there? All the other life signs just went dark." "The team is dead," Jake replied quietly, not wanting to make any sudden movements. "Some kind of ice creatures. They're perfectly designed to kill anything that comes down here. Get out of there right now." "Working on it," Jake said, but he knew the truth. The hunters stood between him and the tunnel they had used to enter the chamber. Even if he could get past them, more were probably waiting in the passages above. Unlike his alien teammates, Jake had no natural advantages to rely on. He was not stronger than the hunters, not faster, not more resistant to cold or capable of existing in multiple dimensions. He was just a human with basic equipment and training in how to survive in hostile environments. But as Jake studied the creatures surrounding him, his human mind began to notice things that his alien teammates had missed. The hunters moved with perfect coordination, but they seemed to avoid certain areas of the chamber. Specifically, they stayed away from spots where thermal vents created small pockets of warmth. Jake also noticed that the creatures' attacks were always focused on exploiting their victims' greatest strengths. They had targeted Rex's confidence, Zach 9's psychic connection, Keth 7's cold resistance, and Wispflow's ability to phase. They were not just mindless predators, they were intelligent enough to identify and counter specific threats. The largest hunter stepped forward, its crystalline body towering over Jake like a living glacier. Energy flowed through its transparent form as it prepared to deliver the same fate to the human that it had given to the others. Jake could feel the temperature around him dropping as the creature focused its power. But instead of trying to fight or run, Jake did something that surprised both himself and the hunters. He slowly reached into his equipment pack and pulled out a small thermal charge, the kind used by Antarctic researchers to melt ice samples for analysis. The hunter paused, perhaps confused by this strange behavior. Its alien mind tried to process what threat this tiny device could possibly pose to a creature that had just destroyed 4 beings with advanced technology and natural superpowers. Jake activated the charge and dropped it at his feet. The small device began to generate heat, creating a warm zone around the human. For the first time since the attack began, the hunters backed away. "Interesting," Jake said softly, his breath no longer visible in the warming air. "You don't like heat very much, do you?" The creature's blue eyes flickered with what might have been uncertainty. They had encountered thousands of intruders over the millennia, but none had ever responded to their attack with such a simple, basic solution. Jake began to understand something that his alien teammates had missed in their final moments. These creatures were not invincible. They just seemed that way because every species that encountered them tried to fight using their greatest strengths. But strength was not always the answer. Sometimes survival meant being smart enough to find the one weakness that everyone else had overlooked. Jake backed away from the hunters slowly, keeping the small thermal charge between himself and the creatures. The warm air around the device created a bubble of safety that the ice predators seemed unwilling to cross. But Jake knew the charge, would only last for a few hours at most. He needed a better plan. The largest hunter made a sound like breaking glass and gestured to the others with movements that looked almost like communication. The creatures spread out around the chamber, blocking every obvious exit while maintaining their distance from Jake's heat source. They were patient predators willing to wait for their prey to make a mistake. "Jake, your vital signs are spiking." Dr. Collins's voice came through the radio. "What's your situation down there?" "Surrounded but alive," Jake replied, studying the chamber around him. "These things don't like heat. I'm buying time with a thermal charge, but I need to find a more permanent solution. Can you reach the tunnel you came down?" Jake looked at the passage entrance, now guarded by two hunters whose blue eyes never left him. "Negative. They're smart, enough to cut off my escape routes. I need to find another way out." As the hours passed, Jake began to notice patterns in the hunters' behavior. They moved in coordinated groups, but their coordination seemed to depend on some kind of communication network that flowed through the ice itself. When Jake moved closer to thermal vents, the creatures' movements became less organized, as if the heat interfered with their ability to work together. Jake also realized that the chamber was not a natural formation. The ancient civilization that built this place had included thermal regulation systems throughout the structure. Some of the ice formations were actually sophisticated technology designed to manage heat and cold. The hunters were not just random predators. They were guard animals, genetically engineered to protect something important. When his first thermal charge began to weaken, Jake carefully activated a second one and moved toward the nearest thermal vent. The hunters followed his movement but kept their distance from the heat. Jake began to form a theory about how these creatures operated and why they were so effective against other species. Every alien race that encountered the hunters tried to fight them using their natural advantages, but these creatures had evolved specifically to counter those advantages. They drained thermal energy from beings that resisted cold, disrupted psychic connections from hive minds, and somehow existed in multiple dimensions to catch incorporeal beings. But humans had no specific, natural advantages to exploit. Jake was not particularly strong, fast, cold-resistant, or psychically gifted. His species had survived on Earth not because they were the best at any one thing, but because they were adaptable enough to learn from their environment and change their behavior accordingly. Jake spent the next several hours playing a deadly game of cat and mouse with the hunters. He moved from thermal vent to thermal vent, using his charges to create safe zones while he studied the chamber's ancient technology. The creatures followed him patiently, but Jake noticed they were becoming frustrated by his refusal to behave like normal prey. During his exploration, Jake discovered something that changed everything. Hidden behind a wall of decorative ice, he found a control panel covered in the same symbols they had seen in the tunnels. The panel was connected to the thermal management system that kept the entire facility operating. Jake's Antarctic training had included basic engineering and systems maintenance. He might not understand alien technology, but heat distribution systems followed certain universal principles. As he studied the controls, Jake began to piece together how the facility worked and why the hunters were so protective of it. The ancient builders had created a geothermal energy collection system that tapped into the moon's core heat. The ice formations were not just decorative. They were part of a massive cooling system that converted thermal energy into other forms of power. The hunters were guard creatures designed to prevent intruders from damaging the delicate balance between hot and cold that kept the system operating. But something had gone wrong long ago. The builders were gone, and their guard animals had become feral. The hunters were still protecting the facility, but they no longer understood what they were protecting or why. They had become mindless killers that attacked anything that entered their territory. Jake realized that escaping the chamber was only part of his problem. Even if he could get past the hunters, more would be waiting in the tunnels above. The entire facility was their hunting ground, and they knew every passage and hiding place. To survive, Jake needed to do more than just avoid the creatures. He needed to understand them well enough to predict their behavior. As his second thermal charge began to weaken, Jake noticed something important about the hunters' positioning. They were not just guarding the exits, they were protecting specific areas of the chamber. The largest concentration of creatures surrounded the central structure that looked like a crystal flower made of ice and metal. Jake studied the structure more carefully and realized it was not decorative. It was the facility's main control center, the brain that coordinated all the thermal management systems throughout the moon. If Jake could reach that control center, he might be able to access the facility's full power and create a heat distribution pattern that would force the hunters to retreat. But getting to the control center meant crossing 30 meters of open space filled with deadly predators. Jake had maybe 1 hour left before his current thermal charge failed completely. After that, he would be defenseless against creatures that had perfected the art of killing over millions of years. Jake checked his remaining equipment and began to plan the most dangerous gambit of his life. He had enough thermal charges to create a path to the control center, but he would have to time everything perfectly. One mistake would leave him frozen solid like his teammates. "Dr. Collins," Jake said into his radio, "I'm going to try something that will either get me out of here or get me killed. If this goes wrong, make sure no other teams come down here without serious firepower and a lot more thermal equipment. Jake, don't do anything crazy. Help is coming." "Help won't arrive in time," Jake replied, activating his third thermal charge. "These creatures have been killing intruders for millions of years, but they've never encountered a human before. Time to show them what that means." The hunters sensed his change in posture and began to close in, their blue eyes glowing brighter with anticipation. They expected this small, soft creature to finally panic and try to run like all the others. Instead, Jake did something that no prey animal had ever done in their experience. He began to walk directly toward their strongest defensive position, carrying fire in his hands like a weapon of war. Jake began his advance toward the central control structure with steady, measured steps. The hunters immediately responded to his movement, but something in his behavior confused them. Instead of running in panic or charging with desperate fury, like other intruders, the human moved with calm purpose that their predatory instincts couldn't categorize. Jake activated thermal charges in sequence, creating a path of warmth across the chamber floor. Each charge forced the nearest hunters to retreat, disrupting their coordinated positioning. For the first time since they had awakened, the creatures found themselves reacting to prey instead of controlling the hunt. The largest hunter, the one Jake had started thinking of as the pack leader, made that sound like breaking glass again. The other creatures responded by trying to circle around Jake's heat trail, but the human had anticipated this. He threw his next charge not forward but to his left, creating a barrier that forced the hunters to bunch together on his right side. "What are you doing down there?" Dr. Collins' voice crackled through the radio. "Your heat signature is moving directly toward the largest concentration of hostile contacts." "Fighting fire with fire," Jake replied, not taking his eyes off the creatures surrounding him. Or in this case, fighting ice with heat. Jake reached the base of the central structure and discovered it was even more complex than he had thought. The crystal formations were not solid ice, but some kind of advanced material that could store and redirect enormous amounts of energy. Thermal conduits ran through the structure like veins, carrying heat from the moon's core to distribution points throughout the facility. But the system was damaged. Millions of years of neglect had caused critical components to fail. The thermal flow was unbalanced, creating hotspots in some areas and dead zones in others. The hunters had adapted to this broken system, learning to avoid the hot zones while using the cold areas as hunting grounds. Jake found what looked like a main access panel and began studying the alien symbols covering its surface. His Antarctic research experience included working with systems from multiple countries, each with different languages and technical standards. The key was understanding the logic behind the design rather than the specific symbols used to represent it. As Jake worked, the hunters grew more agitated. They could sense that their territory was being violated in a way they had never experienced before. The pack leader moved closer, testing the boundaries of Jake's thermal defense zone. Its blue eyes burned with frustration and growing anger. Jake ignored the creatures and focused on the control panel. Slowly, patterns began to emerge from the alien symbols. Triangular shapes seemed to represent thermal flow direction. Circular symbols indicated pressure or intensity levels. Straight lines showed connections between different system components. Working by trial and error, Jake began activating different sections of the thermal management system. Each activation caused changes in the chamber's temperature patterns. Ice formations shifted and rearranged themselves as long-dormant heating elements came back to life. The hunters responded to these changes with increasing panic. Their perfectly controlled environment was becoming unpredictable. Areas that had been cold for millions of years suddenly became warm, safe passages filled with uncomfortable heat. The creatures' coordination began to break down as their communication network was disrupted by thermal interference. Jake discovered that the facility's original purpose was even more ambitious than he had imagined. It was not just a geothermal collection system, it was a planetary engineering project. The ancient builders had been trying to warm Arcturus Prime's entire surface by tapping into the moon's core and redistributing that heat through a network of installations across the surface. The project had failed when the builders died or abandoned the moon, leaving only their guard creatures to protect systems they no longer understood. The hunters had become prisoners of their own success, trapped in a facility that had become their entire world. But Jake also realized that reactivating the full system would do more than just drive away the hunters. It would flood the chamber, with enough heat to melt everything in it, including himself. He needed a more surgical approach that would neutralize the creatures without destroying the facility or cooking himself alive. Jake found the solution in the system's emergency protocols. The ancient builders had included safety measures for thermal overflow situations. Instead of distributing heat evenly throughout the facility, Jake could redirect it all to specific areas while keeping others cool. He could create a pattern that would force the hunters to retreat to safe zones while leaving himself a path to escape. The pack leader seemed to sense what Jake was planning. The creature moved as close to the human as the thermal barriers would allow and made a series of sounds that almost sounded like speech. For a moment, Jake wondered if the hunter was trying to communicate rather than threaten. But there was no time for xenobiology. Jake's thermal charges were running low and he could feel the chamber's temperature dropping as the creatures massed for a final assault. If he was going to act, it had to be now. Jake input the commands he had decoded and activated the facility's emergency thermal redistribution system. Immediately, the crystal formations around him began to glow brighter as massive amounts of heat flowed through the conduits. The temperature in specific areas of the chamber began to rise rapidly, while others remained cold. The hunters reacted with panic. Their comfortable environment was being torn apart by forces they couldn't fight or understand. The pack leader charged directly at Jake, willing to endure the heat rather than lose control of its territory completely. Jake had one thermal charge left. As the massive creature bore down on him, he activated the charge and threw it directly at the hunter's crystalline chest. The concentrated heat struck the creature's core, and Jake heard a sound like a glacier cracking under spring pressure. The pack leader stopped its charge and staggered backward, steam rising from its body as internal ice began to melt. It looked at Jake with something that might have been surprise or respect, then retreated to join the other hunters in the areas that were still cool enough for them to survive. Jake had won the immediate battle, but he was far from safe. The facility's thermal systems were now operating at maximum capacity, and he needed to reach the surface before the entire structure became uninhabitable. He also needed to find a way to ensure that the hunters would not simply return to hunting mode once the system stabilized. As he prepared to leave the control center, Jake made a decision that would define not just his own survival, but the future relationship between humans and these ancient predators. Instead of simply escaping, he was going to try something that no other species had ever attempted with the glacial hunters. He was going to try to understand them well enough to find a solution that would allow both species to coexist. It was a typically human approach to an impossible problem, finding a way to turn enemies into something less than friends, but more than adversaries. Jake stood before the facility's main control system, watching thermal energy flow through crystal conduits like liquid fire. The hunters had retreated to the cooler areas of the chamber, but their blue eyes still tracked his every movement. They were waiting, perhaps hoping that this strange intruder would make a mistake that would allow them to reclaim their territory. Instead of heading for the surface tunnels, Jake did something that surprised both the creatures and Dr. Collins, who was monitoring from orbit. He began studying the facility's historical data logs, searching for information about the hunter's original purpose and programming. "Jake, what are you doing?" Dr. Collins's voice carried equal parts confusion and concern. "The thermal readings show that area is becoming increasingly unstable. You need to evacuate immediately." "Not yet," Jake replied, scrolling through alien data files that his translation software was slowly decoding. "There's something here I need to understand. These creatures aren't just random predators. They were created for a specific purpose, and that purpose might be the key to everything." The data logs revealed the truth about the glacial hunters and their creators. The ancient builders had not been a single species, but a coalition of different races working together on the planetary engineering project. They had designed the hunters to be the ultimate guardians, capable of defending the facility against any possible threat from any known species. But the builders had made a critical error in their programming. They had designed the hunters to counter specific biological and technological advantages, but they had never encountered a species like humans. They had never faced beings whose greatest strength was not any single superior trait, but rather their ability to adapt and learn from their environment. Jake found the facility's master control protocols buried deep in the system's core programming. The ancient builders had included override codes that could reprogram the hunter's behavior patterns, but activating those codes required a level of understanding about the creature's psychology that the builders had never expected any intruder to possess. Jake realized he was facing a test that the ancient builders had never intended, but had accidentally created. To reprogram the hunters, he would need to prove that he understood them well enough to predict how they would respond to different scenarios. It was not enough to simply overpower the creatures. He had to outwit them. Working quickly but carefully, Jake began inputting new behavioral parameters into the hunter's programming. Instead of treating all intruders as threats to be eliminated, the new code would allow the creatures to distinguish between hostile invaders and peaceful researchers. It would create zones where other species could safely explore while preserving the hunter's territory, in areas where their presence was needed to maintain the facility's systems. The largest hunter seemed to sense what Jake was doing. The creature moved closer to the control station, its crystalline body reflecting the thermal energy flowing through the chamber. For the first time since the confrontation began, the hunter's movements showed curiosity rather than aggression. Jake included one final element in his reprogramming: a recognition protocol that would identify humans as the species responsible for restoring the facility's proper function. It was not about claiming dominance over the hunters, but about establishing a relationship based on mutual respect and understanding. When Jake activated the new programming, the changes were immediate and dramatic. The hunter's blue eyes flickered as new behavioral patterns overwrote millions of years of hunting instincts. Their rigid formation dissolved as individual creatures began to explore their environment with something approaching wonder. The pack leader approached Jake slowly, its massive form no longer radiating menace. The creature extended one crystalline appendage toward the human, stopping just short of contact. Jake understood the gesture and carefully reached out to touch the hunter's surface. The crystal was warm rather than cold, heated by the thermal energy flowing through the facility's restored systems. For a moment, predator and prey stood connected by understanding that transcended species barriers. The hunter was no longer a mindless killer, and Jake was no longer just another intruder to be eliminated. "Incredible," Dr. Collins whispered through the radio. "The hostile contacts have completely changed their behavior patterns. How did you do that?" "I treated them like intelligent beings instead of monsters," Jake replied, stepping back from the hunter with respect rather than fear. "They were never evil, just confused and alone. They've been guarding this place for millions of years without understanding why." Jake spent several more hours in the facility, working with the hunters to establish protocols that would allow future research teams to explore safely. The creatures proved to be remarkably intelligent once freed from their original programming. They understood the concept of cooperation and seemed genuinely interested in learning about the beings who had visited their domain. When Jake finally made his way to the surface, he carried with him data files that would revolutionize Galactic understanding of ancient civilizations and artificial life forms, but more importantly, he brought proof that humans possessed something unique among the galaxy's intelligent species: the ability to find peaceful solutions to problems that others considered impossible. Dr. Collins led the rescue team that extracted Jake from the ice moon's surface. As their ship departed Arcturus Prime, Jake looked back at the thermal energy readings that now showed a stable, functioning facility instead of a death trap. The Galactic Council is going to want a full report on this, Dr. Collins said. 4 team members dead, but 1 human survivor who somehow managed to reprogram hostile alien constructs that have been killing intruders for millions of years. They're going to think we made the whole thing up. Jake smiled tiredly. Let them think what they want. The important thing is that other teams will be able to study that facility safely now. The hunters will protect researchers instead of killing them, as long as those researchers respect the boundaries we established. Months later, Jake stood before the Galactic Council to deliver his official report. Representatives from dozens of species listened as he described his survival and the solution he had implemented on Arcturus Prime. The Soran delegation was amazed that a human had survived where their strongest warrior had failed. The Vexari hive mind struggled to understand how an individual had succeeded where their collective intelligence had been defeated. But it was the Lithan representative who asked the question that defined humanity's role in the galactic community. How does a species with no superior biological traits accomplish what beings with advanced natural abilities cannot? Jake's answer became legendary among the galaxy's explorers and researchers. We survive because we refuse to accept that any problem is unsolvable. We adapt because we have to. We find ways to coexist because the alternative is destruction. Other species excel in specific environments or situations. Humans excel at figuring out how to excel when we shouldn't be able to. The story of Jake Murphy's survival on Arcturus Prime spread throughout the galaxy, carried by traders, diplomats, and explorers. It became a defining example of what made humans unique among the stars. Not superior strength or intelligence, but superior adaptability and an almost insane refusal to give up when faced with impossible odds. The glacial hunters still guard their ancient facility on the ice moon, but now they welcome researchers who come in peace. The thermal energy systems continue to function, providing warmth to areas that had been frozen for millions of years. And somewhere in the facility's databanks, stored alongside the records of ancient civilizations, are the behavioral protocols, created by a human who proved that sometimes the greatest victory is not defeating your enemies, but finding a way to transform them into something better than friends, into partners in understanding the universe's infinite mysteries.